Hey guys, welcome to Whispers of History. Tonight, we're stepping into the misty cobblestone alleys and flickering candlelit halls of a world shaped by kings and plagues, queens and poets, revolutions and whispers behind throne room walls. This is not your high school history class. This is the long, winding, deeply human story of England, a story filled with ambition, betrayal, beauty, sorrow, and the slow grinding march of time. So, before we begin our gentle descent into the past, go ahead and dim the lights. Get comfortable, maybe with a blanket or a warm drink, and let the world outside fade for a bit. If you enjoy this kind of quiet storytelling, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, and leaving a thoughtful comment. It helps more than you know. And I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is. For you, that's always such a lovely part of the community here. Alright, now lean back. Let the hum of your room mix with the sound of history, and together, let's begin this slow journey through the quiet corridors of English time. It begins long before the world knew the name England. Long before London was more than a sleepy riverside settlement. The British Isles, isolated from the vast reaches of Europe by the narrow but treacherous channel, were home to scattered tribes and restless spirits who carved their lives into stone, soil, and song. The land itself was ancient rolling hills that had watched the stars shift for millions of years. Cliffs battered by sea winds older than civilization itself. The earliest humans wandered into what we now call England around 800,000 years ago. They came in waves, leaving behind flint tools and ghostly footprints pressed into ancient mudflats. But it wasn't until about 10,000 years ago, after the last ice age retreated, that people began to settle more permanently. They built simple wooden huts and followed the animals. They left behind mysterious marks in the earth. No kings, no crowns, just quiet human persistence. One of the earliest monumental structures in England is also among its most enduring mysteries. Even today, the Great Stone Circle on the Salisbury Plain rises from the grass like something out of a dream. We still don't know exactly why it was built. A celestial calendar, a place of healing, a burial site, maybe all of those. What we do know is that Stonehenge required tremendous effort to build. Some of the stones were brought from over 150 miles away, long before the wheel was in wide use. That kind of commitment suggests something deeply sacred. The people who built Stonehenge left no written records. Their voices are lost, but their intentions echo in stone. It's one of the many moments in English history where silence tells a louder story than words. By the time the Iron Age arrived around 800 BC, England was home to tribal societies, often ruled by powerful chieftains who controlled trade routes, farmland, and warriors. These were the Celts, fierce, proud, deeply spiritual people. They painted their bodies with blue woad and believed in gods that lived in trees, rivers, and the wind itself. They spoke a language that would one day vanish almost completely from the island, and they lived in hill forts and small farming villages. Their lives governed by cycles of sun and harvest. Then came the Romans. It was 55 BCE, when Julius Caesar first arrived with his legions. Wading ashore onto the pebbled beaches of Kent, his first expedition didn't last long. He was testing the waters, so to speak, but he made note of the people, their horses, their war chariots, their wild hair and painted faces. Almost a century later, in 43 CE, Emperor Claudius launched a full invasion. This time, the Romans stayed. Roman Britain was a collision of worlds. Roads carved through the forests. Walled cities emerged where once there had been only huts, baths, aqueducts, temples to Roman gods, all suddenly part of the landscape. Londinium, the town that would one day become London, began as a small Roman trading post on the River Thames. It grew quickly. The empire brought with it administration, taxes, architecture, and also oppression, violence, and resistance. One of the fiercest resistors was a woman, Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe. When her husband died, Roman authorities tried to seize her land and reportedly assaulted her daughters. Boudica responded by rallying a massive rebellion. She set fire 2 Roman settlements, including land. For a brief, fiery moment, she threatened to shake the empire itself. But Rome retaliated with brutal efficiency. Boudicca's army was crushed. She either took poison or died of illness shortly after. Yet her name would never be forgotten. Even today, there's a statue of her chariot and all near Westminster Bridge in London. As centuries passed, Roman Britain became more settled. More Roman villas dotted the countryside, some complete with mosaic floors and central heating. Latin was spoken in courts and markets. Christianity, too, arrived during this time, first as a quiet underground faith, and eventually as an accepted religion. But empires, like everything, are temporary. By the early 5th century, Rome was crumbling. The legions were recalled to defend the heart of the empire, and Britain was left to fend for itself. Without Roman protection, the island faced waves of invasion from the north and east. Germanic tribes, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes crossed the sea and began to settle. They didn't come to trade or visit. They came to stay. These were not the Celts. They spoke new languages, worshipped different gods, and brought with them a culture that would gradually reshape the land. Old towns fell into ruin. Roman villas were abandoned. A New England was being born literally, in name. Angleland, the land of the Angles, eventually became England. The Saxon period is one of both darkness and quiet growth. Writing was rare. Much of what we know comes from later chroniclers or from archaeology. But we do know that kingdoms began to emerge: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, Kent. These were not unified lands, but patchworks of warlords and petty kings, constantly shifting in power and allegiance. It was also during this time that Christianity returned in force. In 597, Pope Gregory the Great sent a missionary named Augustine to convert the Anglo-Saxons. He landed in Kent and eventually became the first Archbishop of Canterbury. Slowly, pagan temples were replaced by churches. Monasteries became centers of learning and preservation, copying ancient texts and creating new ones in the emerging English tongue. And then, just as England began to find its rhythm again, the longboats appeared on the horizon, the Vikings. From the late 8th century onward, Norse warriors from Scandinavia launched repeated raids on the English coast. Monasteries, with their gold and lack of defenses, were prime targets. The famous raid on Lindisfarne in 793 is often marked as the beginning of the Viking Age in England. The brutality shocked Christian chroniclers. They described the Norsemen as demons hair wild, axes dripping, shrieking as they cut through, men of the cloth. But the Vikings didn't just raid. They settled. They established their own communities, especially in the north and east of England. This area became known as the Danelaw, where Danish law, not Anglo-Saxon law, held sway. Despite the violence, there was also exchanged trade flourished between English and Norse towns. Intermarriage happened. Languages blended. But the fight for dominance was constant by the 9th century. One man stood out against the Viking Tydalfrid of Wessex. Remembered as Alfred the Great, he was not just a warrior, but a scholar. He understood the importance of knowledge and learning. He commissioned translations of Latin texts into English, promoted education, and reformed military defenses. Under his leadership, Wessex resisted Viking conquest and began the slow, painful work of uniting England under a single rule. Alfred died in 899, but his dream endured. His descendants continued the fight, gradually pushing back Viking influence. By the mid-10th century, a unified kingdom of England had emerged. Fragile but real, yet peace never lasted long. In 1066, one of the most pivotal years in English history unfolded. The childless King Edward the Confessor died, leaving behind a contested throne. Harold Godwinson, a powerful noble, claimed it. But across the Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, also laid claim. He argued that Edward had promised him the crown years earlier, and William wasn't the type to let promises slide. He crossed the sea with an army, met Harold at the Battle of Hastings, and changed English history forever. But that, is where we will begin next time. So if you're still awake, thank you. for spending your evening in the quiet folds of time with me. And if you've drifted off, I hope it's into dreams lit by torchlight and echoing with the distant clang of swords on shields. Until next time, sleep well and keep wondering. The morning after Hastings, the English landscape felt different, not because the hills had shifted or the winds had changed, but because something in the heart of England had been broken and something entirely new was being stitched into its place. The Anglo-Saxons, who had ruled and wrestled over the land for centuries, were no longer at the top of the chain. Now, a foreign Duke William of Normandy stood as the conqueror of an entire kingdom. They would call him William the Conqueror, though in his native Normandy, he'd once been known as William the Bastard. It had taken just one decisive battle to turn the tides. On the fields near Hastings, in October of 1066, Harold Godwinson, the last crowned Anglo-Saxon king, fell in combat. Some said to an arrow in the eye, though we'll never know for certain. What we do know is that Harold's death shattered any unified resistance, and within weeks, William was marching toward London, methodically taking control of strongholds and demanding oaths of fealty from frightened nobles and clergy. The coronation took place on Christmas Day, 1066, at Westminster Abbey. William, dressed in ceremonial robes, stood among English lords who could barely mask their unease. During the coronation, as the crowd shouted their approval in Old English and Norman French, the guards outside mistook the noise for a riot and began setting buildings on fire. It was a fitting start to a reign that would be marked by deep cultural fracture and uneasy coexistence. William brought more than just an army. He brought a new ruling class. In the years that followed, he systematically stripped Anglo-Saxon nobles of their lands and handed them over to Norman barons, knights, and bishops. These new lords didn't speak English. They spoke a coarse, war-hardened dialect of Old French. To the peasantry, still largely Anglo-Saxon, it must have felt like their own land had turned alien overnight. Castles, previously rare, sprang up across the countryside, massive stone fortresses with towering keeps and moats. These weren't just homes, they were statements, symbols of power, of conquest. One of William's most ambitious tools of control was the Domesday Book. Commissioned in 1085, it was essentially a kingdom-wide survey. Every field, pig, and mill was recorded. Who owned what, who owed what. It was detailed, brutal, and unflinching, hence the name Doomsday, echoing the Day of Judgment. To many peasants, it must have felt just like that. But to William, it was necessary. Power, after all, thrives on information. And yet, for all the violence and upheaval, something new was growing in the cracks between the cultures. Anglo-Saxon and Norman customs began to blend. The English language itself started to change, absorbing French words, especially those related to law, governance, cuisine, and nobility. An Anglo-Saxon might farm the land using the word cow, but when that cow was cooked and served at a noble's feast, it became beef, from the French boeuf. It was a small but telling detail, showing just how deeply class and language were intertwined. William ruled until 1087, when he died. He left behind a realm that was wealthier, more centralized, and more tightly controlled than anything England had known before, but also a kingdom divided by class, culture, and a growing unease. His sons would inherit both the throne and the tensions. The first, William Rufus, called Rufus for his ruddy complexion, took the throne but ruled with arrogance and cruelty. He favored his Norman supporters, squeezed taxes from his people, and seemed to have little patience for the church. In 1100, while hunting in the New Forest, William Rufus was struck by an arrow and killed. The details are still debated. Was it a hunting accident or a quiet assassination? Either way, his younger brother, Henry, wasted no time. He rode to Winchester, seized the royal treasury, and had himself crowned as King Henry I within days. Henry was clever. He knew the value of appearances. He issued a charter restoring certain Anglo-Saxon rights. He married Edith of Scotland, a descendant of Alfred the Great, and changed her name to Matilda to make it sound more Norman. It was political theater, but it worked. Many Anglo-Saxons saw it as a symbolic reunion of the old and new bloodlines. Henry's reign was marked by administrative reforms. He strengthened the royal court system and built a stronger central bureaucracy. But tragedy haunted him. His only legitimate son, William Adelin, drowned in the White Ship disaster in 1120, an event that would plunge the country into one of its most chaotic periods. With no male heir, Henry named his daughter Matildias, the same one as his successor, but when he died in 1135, the nobility refused to accept a woman as ruler. Instead, they backed Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois. What followed was a brutal civil war known simply as the Anarchy. It lasted nearly 20 years. During this time, England fractured into localized pockets of power. Castles changed hands. Villages were burned. Alliances shifted like sand in the tide. Chroniclers wrote of fields untilled, homes deserted, people starving. Christ and his saints slept, one monk wrote, capturing the spiritual despair of a nation, torn apart by ambition and betrayal. Eventually, after years of fighting and stalemates, a compromise was reached. Stephen would rule for the remainder of his life, but Matilda's son young Henry of Anjou would inherit the throne after him. When Stephen died in 1154, that's exactly what happened. And so began the reign of one of the most powerful and controversial monarchs in English history, Henry II. Henry II was a towering figure, both in ambition and temper. He was intelligent, energetic, and relentless. He ruled not just England, but vast territories in France, including Normandy, Anjou and Aquitaine, thanks in large part to his marriage to the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in Europe. That Eleanor had been Queen of France before marrying Henry. She was cultured, political, and utterly unafraid to challenge authority, even her husband's. Their marriage would produce 8 children, including Richard the Lionheart and John, but also intense conflict and betrayal. Henry's greatest clash came not with a rival king, but with his own friend Thomas Becket. Becket had been Henry's close advisor and drinking companion. When the position of Archbishop of Canterbury became vacant, Henry appointed Becket, expecting him to be a loyal servant. But Becket underwent a dramatic transformation. Once he wore the robes of the church, he took its authority seriously, too seriously for Henry's liking. The two clashed over legal jurisdiction and the independence of ecclesiastical courts. The quarrel deepened until, in a moment of frustration, Henry reportedly exclaimed, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights took the words literally. In 1170, they rode to Canterbury and murdered Becket inside the cathedrals, striking him down at the altar. The shock reverberated across Christendom. Becket became a martyr and was quickly canonized as a saint. Henry, facing a wave of public outrage, walked barefoot through Canterbury and allowed monks to whip him as a sign of penance. But while Henry's rule had been powerful, it ended in heartbreak. His sons rebelled against him, urged on, some say, by their mother Eleanor. Henry died in 1189, defeated and embittered. His son, Richard Ibeda, known as Richard the Lionheart, was crowned next. Richard is remembered as a chivalric hero, a crusader king, and yet he spent only about 6 months of his entire 10-year reign in England. The rest of the time, he was either fighting in the Holy Land during the Third Crusade or imprisoned in Europe. During his absence, the real burden of governance fell to others, especially his brother, John. When Richard died in 1199, John became king, and if Richard was seen as a lion, John was often remembered as a snake. He was mistrusted, greedy, and cruel. He lost vast tracts of English territory in France. He quarreled with the Pope, was excommunicated, and imposed crushing taxes on his barons. But it was in 1215 that things truly reached a boiling point. Faced with rebellious nobles, John was forced to seal the Magna Carta document that, for the first time, limited the power of the English monarch and established certain legal rights. Though the original document applied mainly to nobles and landowners, its principles would echo through history, influencing everything from British common law to the American Constitution. Still, John had little intention of honoring the charter. He died in 1216, leaving behind a boy king, Henry III, who would rule for decades but struggle to maintain stability. And so the 13th century wore on, with kings rising and falling, laws reshaped, castles rebuilt, and the English people caught in the ebb and flow of their rulers' ambitions, but nothing, no charter, no crown would prepare the land for what was coming next. Plague, war, and rebellion on a scale England had never known. But for now, if your eyes are heavy, and your thoughts beginning to wander, rest easy. The story will still be here when you wake. The 13th century drifted to a close under the long reign of Henry III, a king whose heart leaned more toward grandeur and ceremony than governance and war. He loved architecture, most famously rebuilding Westminster Abbey in the Grand Gothic style, and surrounded himself with foreign advisors and artists, much to the frustration of the English nobility. His reign was marked by chronic financial woes and uneasy relationships with the barons, who technically owed him loyalty, but increasingly resented his methods. These tensions eventually exploded into open conflict, culminating in what would be remembered as the Second Barons' War. Leading the rebellion was Simon de Montfort, a French-born noble who had once been one of Henry's most trusted allies, even marrying the king's sister. But idealism turned to frustration, and frustration to civil war. At the heart of Montfort's cause was the belief that the king's power must be checked not simply for the benefit of the barons, but for the good of the realm. In 1265, after defeating Henry at the Battle of Luz, Montfort summoned what is often called the first true English Parliament. It was still deeply limited by today's standards, mostly nobles and churchmen, but it planted the seed of something new. The idea that governance required more voices than just the monarchs. The experiment was short. That same year, Montfort was killed at the Battle of Evesham, his body mutilated in the field by royalist forces. But his ideas would echo through the coming centuries. After Henry III's death, his son Edward I took the throne, a very different man, tall, imposing, and ruthless in matters of state. Edward believed in strong kingship and the unification of his realm through power, not persuasion. He was a conqueror, earning the title Hammer of the Scots, and left deep scars in Wales and Scotland that are still remembered today. Edward began by subjugating Wales. He built massive castles, Carnarvon, Conwy, Harlech, and others, meant to house garrisons, intimidate locals, and serve as permanent symbols of English rule. But it was in Scotland where his ambitions faced their fiercest resistance. The death of the Scottish king in 1286 led to a crisis of succession. Edward was invited to arbitrate, but instead treated the situation as an opportunity for domination. What followed was a brutal period of English interference, sparking resistance from figures like William Wallace, who led guerrilla-style attacks against English forces. Though Wallace was eventually captured and executed in 1305, his memory became legend. Then came Robert the Bruce, who in 1314 delivered a crushing blow to English hopes of conquest at the Battle of Bannockburn. The fight for Scottish independence would stretch on for years, but Edward I did not live to see it. He died in 1307, en route to one last campaign into the north. His son, Rude II, inherited the throne, but lacked his father's iron will. He surrounded himself with favorites, especially the controversial peers, Gaveston, and alienated, powerful nobles. His reign was marked by military failures, particularly against the Scots, and mounting resentment from the barons. Eventually, even his own wife, Isabella of France, turned against him. In 1327, Edward was deposed, an almost unthinkable act against the reigning monarch. He was imprisoned and, according to many accounts, later murdered in gruesome fashion, though the details are still debated. His downfall sent a chilling message. No king was beyond reach. His son, Edward III, ascended the throne at just 14 years old. Under his reign, England began to recover, and soon, to rise. Edward was a charismatic warrior king who reinvigorated the monarchy, embraced the ideals of chivalry, and laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most significant conflicts in European history, the 100 Years' War. It all began with a question of succession. In 1328, the King of France died without a direct male heir. Edward III, through his mother's line, had a plausible claim, but the French nobility refused to consider inheritance through a woman and chose Philip VI instead. Edward was in some opportunistic. What started as a dispute over a crown became a century-long struggle for dominance between England and France. The early battles went surprisingly well for England. Edward's army, though smaller, used new tactics: longbows instead of traditional crossbows, smaller groups of disciplined soldiers rather than lumbering knights. At Crécy in 1346, the English destroyed a much larger French force. Then came the Siege of Calais, which Edward captured and kept as a vital English foothold on the continent. It was during this period, in 1348, that England was struck by a force more terrifying than any army: the Black Death, the plague. Likely brought by ship from Europe, swept through towns and villages with horrifying speed. Entire families died within days. Streets were filled with the sound of weeping, prayers, and the tolling of church bells. It's estimated that between a third and a half of England's population perished. Fields went unplowed. Churches were left empty. The very fabric of daily life unraveled. And yet, as always, from catastrophe came change. With so many dead, labor became scarce. Serfs, who had once been bound to their lord's land, suddenly found themselves in high demand. They could demand better wages, better conditions, or leave entirely. It was a quiet revolution, not born in the halls of power, but in the empty villages and overgrown fields of rural England. The ruling class pushed back. In 1351, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. But the changes were irreversible. The old feudal order had cracked. By the late 14th century, the cracks widened into revolt. In 1381, frustration reached its peak in the Peasants' Revolt, one of the most extraordinary uprisings in English history. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and inspired by the radical preacher John Ball, thousands of peasants marched on London, demanding an end to oppressive taxes and serfdom. When Adam delved an eavespan, who was then the gentleman, Ball asked, challenging the very notion of divine hierarchy. The rebels stormed the Tower of London, killed royal officials, and terrified the court. A young King Richard II, only 14 at the time, rode out to meet them. He promised reforms. He spoke with calm authority. And then, after the rebels dispersed, he reneged on every promise and executed their leaders. Still, something had changed. The monarchy had seen fear in the eyes of the people, and the people had seen that kings could be confronted not just in the field, but in the city square. Richard II's reign, after that, spiraled into increasing paranoia and tyranny. He exiled and executed political rivals, tried to rule without parliament, and became increasingly isolated. In 1399, he was deposed by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. It was another moment of seismic shift, a usurpation once again. At the highest level, Henry IV's rule marked the beginning of the House of Lancaster branch of the royal family that would soon be locked in one of the most infamous dynastic struggles in English history, the Wars of the Roses. But, for now, England was focused on surviving. Henry IV faced rebellions, illness, and a kingdom wary of more bloodshed. His son, however, would prove to be one of England's most legendary kings. Henry VIII, the king. Henry V embodied the chivalric ideal, but also the ruthless pragmatism of a seasoned general. In 1415, he launched a campaign in France and met the French army at Agincourt. Against all odds, outnumbered and outarmored, the English triumphed. English longbowmen devastated French knights, turning a muddy field into a killing ground. The victory immortalized Henry in both legend and literature, especially in Shakespeare's stirring plays. By the Treaty of Troyes, Henry was recognized as heir to the French throne and married Catherine of Valois, cementing a brief Anglo-French alliance. But the peace wouldn't last. Henry died young in 1422, leaving behind an infant son, Henry VI. The new king was a child, and a fragile one. Unlike his father, Henry VI was gentle, scholarly, and deeply religious, but unfit for the brutal demands of kingship. Under his reign, England slowly lost its gains in France. By the mid-15th century, almost all the English holdings in France were gone, except Calais. The 100 Years' War came to an end, not with a treaty, but with exhaustion. At home, England descended into chaos. The nobility, divided by old grudges and rival claims to the throne, began to choose sides. Two great houses, Lancaster and York, both descendants of Edward III, faced off in a series of brutal, bloody conflicts that would last for decades. The Wars of the Roses, and in the shadows of every battle, behind every shifting alliance, the people of England waited, watched, suffered, but that, dear listener, is a story for another night. If your mind is wandering and your breath slow, let the clashing of swords fade into silence, and rest knowing the next chapter is waiting just around the corner. The sun rose over a fractured kingdom, its light casting long shadows across fields soaked with the blood of brothers. The Wars of the Roses had begun, not as a single clash, but as a bitter unraveling of loyalties. Born from deep-rooted questions about legitimacy, inheritance, and royal competence, for nearly 30 years, England would be gripped by this dynastic civil war. Its countryside echoing with the cries of the fallen. Its throne passed from hand to hand like a poisoned chalice. At the heart of it were two rival branches of the royal house of Plantagenet, Lancaster and York, both descended from Edward III, both believing they had a stronger claim to the throne. The Lancastrians wore a red rose as their emblem, while the House of York bore a white one, but in reality, there was little romance to these roses, only politics, betrayal, and death. The reigning king at the war's outbreak was Henry VI of Lancaster, gentle, devout man, but plagued by mental illness and wholly unsuited to rule. His bouts of catatonia left England rudderless, and power slipped into the hands of ambitious nobles. Chief among them was Richard, Duke of York, who believed his lineage gave him not only the right but the duty to replace Henry. At first, the conflict was not about removing the king, but about who should govern in his name. But ambition rarely stops halfway. In 1455, the first open battle was fought at St. Albans. It was brief, but bloody. And though the Yorkists emerged victorious, the war was only beginning. Over the following decades, England became a patchwork of shifting allegiances. Nobles raised private armies, castles were besieged, fields were burned, and the ordinary people, farmers, laborers, tradesmen, were pulled into a conflict that had little to do with them, and everything to do with the pride and bloodlines of the elite. Richard of York was killed in 1460 at the Battle of Wakefield. His head was displayed on the walls of York, mocking his ambitions. But his son, Edward, picked up the mantle. Charismatic, tall, and capable in battle, Edward marched on London and declared himself King Edward IV. Henry VI, feeble and confused, was imprisoned. For a while, it seemed the Yorkists had triumphed. But the war refused to die. Edward's one-time ally, the powerful Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, grew disillusioned. Angry over being sidelined, he switched sides, restored Henry VI to the throne for a brief moment, and sent Edward into exile. But Edward returned in force, defeated Warwick at Barnet, and crushed the Lancastrians at Tewkesbury in 1471. Prince Edward, Henry VI's only son and heir, was killed. Soon after, the old king himself died murdered in the Tower of London. It was whispered that with the Lancastrian line extinguished, Edward IV ruled unchallenged. But even victory offered no peace. Edward's later years were marked by increasing autocracy and personal indulgence. His sudden death in 1483 plunged the kingdom into another crisis. His eldest son, Edward V, was only 12 years old, and the country needed a protector. That role fell to Edward IV's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard's reputation was complex, loyal, brave, a capable commander, but ambitious. In a move that would echo down the centuries, Richard declared his nephews illegitimate and claimed the crown for himself. He became Richard III. The two princes, Edward V and his younger brother, were lodged in the Tower of London, and soon after, vanished from public view. Their fate remains one of history's great mysteries. Most historians believe they were murdered, likely on Richard's orders, but there is no definitive proof, only silence. Richard III's reign was brief and troubled, though he attempted reforms and sought to stabilize the realm. The stain of the missing princes and the betrayal of his brother's legacy cast a long shadow. Discontent simmered, and across the sea, a new challenger prepared to strike. Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant. Henry had spent much of his life in exile, biding his time. In 1485, he sailed from France with a small army, landing in Wales and marching through England. On the fields of Bosworth, his forces met Richard III's in one final clash. The battle was fierce, chaotic. Richard, refusing to flee, charged into the fray, seeking to kill Henry and end the war in a single blow. He fought valiantly, but was overwhelmed. His crown, it said, was found on the battlefield, tangled in a thorn bush. Henry placed it on his head, then and there. With that, the Wars of the Roses ended, and a new dynasty began. The Tudors. Henry VII, as he was now called, married Elizabeth of York, uniting the feuding houses and symbolically healing decades of bloodshed. Their union gave birth to the Tudor Rose, a white and red hybrid still used today. But while Henry's rule ended the war, it did not end paranoia. He was a cautious, calculating king obsessed with securing his lineage and eliminating threats. He used spies, careful marriages, and heavy taxes to consolidate power. But he succeeded. In his aim, when he died in 1509, the throne passed securely to his son. That son was Henry VIII. Henry VIII would become one of the most iconic, controversial, and transformative kings in English history. When he first ascended, he was handsome, athletic, and popular. He loved music, sport, and pageantry. But beneath the surface burned a determination to shape the kingdom in his image no matter the cost. He married Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his brother, and for years they were seen as the ideal royal couple. But as time passed and Catherine failed to produce a male heir, Henry's frustration grew. Obsessed with securing the Tudor line, he became convinced that his marriage was cursed. When the Pope refused to annul it, Henry made a decision that would change the religious and political landscape of England forever. He broke from the Roman Catholic Church in 1534. Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. The break was both personal and political. Monasteries were dissolved, their lands seized, their riches poured into the royal treasury. Those who resisted, including Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, were executed. Henry married 6 times in total. Catherine of Aragon gave him a daughter Mary, Anne Boleyn gave him another Elizabeth, but was accused of adultery and beheaded. Jane Seymour finally delivered a son, Edward, but died shortly after childbirth. His other marriages of Cleves annulled, Catherine Howard executed, and Catherine Parr survived added layers of scandal, tragedy, and intrigue. The king who had once dazzled with charm and youth ended his reign bloated, sick, and paranoid, his once splendid court now dominated by fear. When Henry VIII died in 1547, his son Edward VI took the throne at just 9 years old. England, by now, was firmly Protestant, but the young king's health was fragile. He died at 15, and in a desperate attempt to prevent the return of Catholicism, Protestant nobles placed Lady Jane Grey on the throne. She ruled for just 9 days before being deposed by Mary, Henry's eldest daughter. Queen Mary I, forever known as Bloody Mary, sought to undo the Reformation. She reunited England with the Catholic Church and began a campaign of persecution. Protestants were burned at the stake. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain was unpopular, and though she tried to produce an heir, her body betrayed her. Possibly suffering from phantom pregnancies, she died childless in 1558. Her half-sister, Elizabeth, now ascended the throne, and, with her, England stepped into a golden age. But we'll step into that age next time. For now, let the whispers of court intrigue and the echoes of battlefield cries fade into stillness. The Tudor court awaits us full of spies, sailors, poets, and queens, but it can wait until you're ready. The air in London felt different the day Elizabeth took the throne. Cold perhaps, but full of expectation. She was 25 years old, flame-haired, sharp-eyed, and entirely aware of the impossible weight now pressing down on her shoulders. England had just endured decades of religious whiplash, financial strain, and dynastic bloodshed. Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, the so-called bastard queen to some, was not merely stepping into power, she was walking into a kingdom riddled with uncertainty, and yet, from the very beginning, she walked with poise. She chose her words with care, wore symbolism like armor, and held herself with a kind of theatrical grace that would become her hallmark. When Parliament pressed her to marry and produce an heir, she smiled politely and delayed. When foreign ambassadors tested her intelligence, she responded in elegant Latin. And when Protestants and Catholics alike watched with suspicion, she carefully crafted a middle path, a Church of England that was Protestant in doctrine, but retained enough ceremony to feel familiar. The Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559 set the tone for her reign. It wasn't about radical theology, it was about survival. A unified state church, loyal to the crown, but broad enough to contain a variety of beliefs. And while dissenters were punished, Elizabeth, unlike her predecessors, tried to avoid bloodshed where possible. She knew that unity wasn't found in fire, it was found in patience and clever compromise. But even as she crafted a new religious order, challenges loomed. The most persistent threat to her throne came from her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary had once been Queen of France, and was now the Catholic Queen of Scotland, a rival claimant to the English crown in the eyes of many European powers. After being deposed in Scotland and fleeing south, Mary became Elizabeth's prisoner for nearly 2 decades, kept in a rotating series of castles under constant guard. Elizabeth agonized over what to do. To execute a fellow queen, especially a cousin, was unprecedented. It would send a signal to the world that royalty was no protection from the axe. But when plots were discovered, most famously, the Babington plot, which sought to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne, the choice was no longer political, but personal. In 1587, Mary was executed at Fothering Castle. She wore a crimson dress beneath her black mourning gown, the color of Catholic martyrdom. Her final moments were dignified. Her death sent ripples across Europe. It also set the stage for England's next great crisis. Spain. King Philip II of Spain, once Mary Tudor's husband, was now one of the most powerful monarchs in the world. A devout Catholic, he viewed Elizabeth as a heretic, and Mary's execution as a provocation. England had been poking the Spanish bear for years, supporting Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, and allowing English privateers like Sir Francis Drake to plunder Spanish ships on the high seas. Tensions finally broke in 1588, when Philip launched the Spanish Armada. It was a massive fleet designed to invade England, dethrone Elizabeth, and restore Catholic rule. But England was ready. Its smaller, more maneuverable ships harassed the Armada through the Channel, aided by favorable winds and clever tactics. Fireships were sent drifting into the Spanish formation at night, scattering their line. Storms battered the retreating fleet as it circled Scotland and Ireland. Fewer than half the ships returned home. The defeat of the Armada was not just a military victoriette, was a moment of national myth-making. Elizabeth stood before her troops at Tilbury in armor, declaring, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." Those words were burned into memory. The Virgin Queen had become a symbol of English resilience, wrapped in the glow of divine favor. Her court became a center of art and exploration. Playwrights like William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Ben Jonson brought the English language to life on stage. Their works captured the complexities of love, power, jealousy, ambition, and madness. Meanwhile, explorers like Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake mapped the New World, bringing back tales of exotic lands, strange peoples, and unimaginable riches. But beneath the golden glow, shadows still stretched. Elizabeth ruled alone. She never married, and her refusal to name an heir created constant anxiety. As she aged, her court grew more uncertain. Factions rose and fell. Ambitious nobles jostled for position. She once said, "Though I be a woman, yet I have as good a courage, answerable to my place, as ever my father had." And she meant it. But even the strongest sovereigns must eventually fall. When Elizabeth died in 1603, the Tudor dynasty ended with her. She had reigned for 44 years and transformed England from a divided backwater into a rising global power. But her death brought not just grief, it brought a new king, James VI of Scotland. The son of Mary, Queen of Scots, now became James I of England. For the first time, the crowns of England and Scotland were united not by conquest, but by blood. James was an intellectual, fascinated by theology and the occult. He believed in the divine right of kings, which would become a point of conflict with a parliament that had grown bolder under Elizabeth. His reign was marked by contradictions. On one hand, he authorized the King James Bible, majestic translation, still revered today. On the other, his court was filled with favorites, whispered scandals, and failed attempts at political unity. He survived the infamous gunpowder plot of 1605, when a group of Catholic conspirators, led by Guy Fawkes, attempted to blow up Parliament during its opening session. The plot was foiled, and November 5th became a national day of remembrance. With bonfires and fireworks marking the failed attack, James's obsession with peace led him to avoid costly wars. But it also frustrated the more militaristic members of his court, and when he died in 1625, his son, Charles I, inherited a kingdom on edge. Charles lacked his father's flexibility. He believed absolutely in the divine right of kings and had little patience for dissent. He clashed almost immediately with money, over religion, over the extent of royal authority. In 1629, he dissolved Parliament entirely and ruled alone for 11 years, a period known as the personal rule. But the tensions continued to build. Charles's religious policies alienated Puritans and other Protestant reformers. His perceived favoritism toward Catholic-style rituals caused panic. When he attempted to impose religious reforms in Scotland, riots broke out. Soon, the Scottish army was marching south. Needing money to raise an army, Charles was forced to recall Parliament in 1640. The result was an explosion. Over the next 2 years, England descended into civil war. Royalists, those loyal to the king, faced off against parliamentarians who believed that the monarch's power must be limited by the will of the people. The country was torn apart. Fathers fought sons. Cities split down the middle. Churches were burned. Entire families were ruined. It was not merely a political struggle, it was existential. Leading the parliamentarian forces was Oliver Cromwell, a military commander of deep Puritan faith and unshakable resolve. His new model army was disciplined, organized, and ruthless. Battle after battle, the king's forces were driven back. In 1646, Charles surrendered, but the conflict was far from over. Charles negotiated in secret, hoping to spark another uprising. He succeeded briefly, but the Second Civil War was crushed. This time, Parliament had had enough. In 1649, Charles was put on trial for treason. The proceedings were unprecedented. A king, judged by his own subjects. Charles refused to recognize the court's authority, but it made no difference. He was found guilty. On January 30th, 1649, Charles I stepped onto a scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. He wore 2 shirts so he wouldn't shiver in the cold and be mistaken for afraid. He spoke calmly, asserting his innocence and his belief in monarchy. Then he laid his head on the block, and with a single stroke, the axe fell. The monarchy was dead. England was now a republic. Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protector, not a king, but a ruler in all but name. He ruled with stern Puritan values. Music, theatre, and even Christmas celebrations were suppressed. England became a godly commonwealth, or so it was meant to be. But many soon longed for the old ways. When Cromwell died in 1658, His son Richard tried to succeed him, but lacked the strength. The experiment in republicanism crumbled. In 1660, after years of political chaos, Parliament invited Charles II, son of the executed king, to return. He rode into London to cheering crowds, and the monarchy was restored. But the world he returned to was not the same, and that, dear listener, is where we'll pick up next time. With a kingdom that had killed its king, and now knelt before another, uncertain whether it was redemption, or just the calm before another storm. The bells of London rang out as Charles II entered the city in May of 1660. His return met with cheers, flowers tossed from windows, and a deep national sigh of relief. After more than a decade of war, revolution, and grim republican rule under the Puritans, England was ready for something brighter, something more human. Charles II brought that in abundance. Nicknamed the Merry Monarch, he was charming, witty, theatrical, and unashamedly indulgent. But beneath his warm smile and confident strut was a man who had learned the price of miscalculation. His father had lost his head. Charles had no intention of losing his own. The Restoration, as this period came to be known, was more than a return of the king. It was a return of color, laughter, music, and public celebration. The theatres, long shuttered under Cromwell, reopened. The Church of England was re-established as the national religion, and the people, weary of sermons and military rule, flocked back to their old pleasures. But Charles's reign was not without shadows. Though outwardly popular, Charles inherited a kingdom still riven by religious tensions. Beneath the laughter and the mask balls, old fears simmered. The king himself was sympathetic to Catholics. His mother had been one, his queen was one, and rumors swirled that he might even convert himself. Parliament, deeply Protestant, kept a wary eye. Anti-Catholic laws remained in place, and suspicions turned into hysteria with the rise of one of the most bizarre and dangerous fabrications in English history, the Popish Plot. In 1678, a disreputable clergyman named Titus Oates claimed that there was a vast Catholic conspiracy to assassinate Charles and place his Catholic brother, James, Duke of York, on the throne. His allegations were entirely false, but in a nation primed to believe the worst of Catholics, the story spread like fire. Innocent men were arrested, tortured, and executed. The hysteria consumed the court. Charles, privately skeptical, allowed the madness to run for a time, unwilling to risk public fury. That public fury would turn again toward James, Charles's brother and heir. James openly professed his Catholicism, a bold and dangerous move in a country that had made Protestantism part of its national identity. The fear of a Catholic monarch returned in full force, and for years, political factions, Whigs and Tories, fought bitterly over whether James should be excluded from the line of succession. Charles, ever the pragmatist, dissolved Parliament multiple times to shield his brother. He ruled with quiet cunning, maintaining a careful balance between courtly indulgence and iron political control. But when he died suddenly in 1685, the kingdom fell squarely into the hands of the man everyone had feared. James II was not like his brother. Where Charles had been warm, subtle, and compromising, James was rigid, devout, and openly authoritarian. He quickly alienated powerful factions by appointing Catholics to high offices, building a standing army near London, and issuing declarations of religious tolerance that bypassed Parliament altogether. The final straw came in 1688, when James's second wife gave birth to a sooner Catholic heir who threatened to establish a permanent Catholic dynasty. Until then, many had assumed that James's Protestant daughter, Mary, would eventually succeed him. Now, that hope was dashed. So, in a swift and largely bloodless coup, a group of English nobles secretly invited Mary and her husband, William, of Orange, both Protestants living in the Netherlands, to invade. William landed on English shores in November. James, stunned by the betrayal, fled the country. It was, effectively, an abdication. This moment, called the Glorious Revolution, marked one of the most significant shifts in English political history. Parliament offered the crown jointly to William and Mary, but not unconditionally. They had to agree to a Bill of Rights that limited royal power. guaranteed parliamentary supremacy, and enshrined civil liberties. No Catholic could ever again inherit the English throne. England was no longer an absolute monarchy. The idea of divine right was dead. In its place was a constitutional monarchian arrangement that would shape the British system of government. For centuries, the new reign ushered in stability, but also conflict. William and Mary ruled as co-sovereigns until Mary's death in 1694, after which William reigned alone. He spent much of his time fighting continental wars against France, particularly Louis XIV, whose ambition threatened to engulf Europe. England's foreign policy, once insular, now became deeply entangled in European power politics. In 1702, after William's death, the throne passed to Mary's sister, Anne. Queen Anne was devout, kind-hearted, and tragically plagued by personal sorrow. She endured 17 pregnancies, yet none of her children survived to adulthood. Her reign marked the final chapter of the Stuart dynasty, but also a critical political transformation. It was under Anne that England and Scotland officially united in 1707, forming the Kingdom of Great Britain. Though the two had shared a monarch since James I, they were still legally separate realms. The Act of Union merged their parliaments, flags, and trade. The Union Jack became the new banner of a growing empire. Anne's reign also witnessed the rise of two powerful political parties, Whigs and Tories, each vying for influence. But as her health declined and her lack of heirs became impossible to ignore, Parliament turned once more to the question of succession. They settled on a distant Protestant relative, the Electress Sophia of Hanover. When she died shortly before Anne, her son George inherited the crown as George I. And so the Hanoverian dynasty began in 1714. George I was German. He spoke little English, cared more for his homeland than for Britain, and left much of governance to his ministers. This disinterest, however, had lasting consequences. It allowed Parliament, especially the office of the Prime Minister, to grow in power. Sir Robert Walpole, often considered Britain's first Prime Minister in practice, emerged during this period, shaping policy and managing royal affairs while the king remained largely in the background. The 18th century now opened on a new kind of monarchy, less personal, more institutional. The country grew wealthier, more powerful, and increasingly global. Trade flourished, colonies expanded, and British ships crossed every ocean. London became a hub of finance, fashion, and philosophical thought. But peace never lasted long. In 1745, the last serious attempt to restore the Stuart line erupted in the form of the Jacobite Rebellion. Charles Edward Stuart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, landed in Scotland. Seeking to reclaim the throne for his Catholic family, he rallied Highland clans, marched south, and for a time, looked as though he might succeed. But the rebellion collapsed at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. It was a massacre. The Jacobite dream died there, on a windswept moor, and the British state cracked down harshly on Highland culture, outlawing kilts, tartans, and Gaelic customs. Meanwhile, George II, and later George III, would preside over the rise of the British Empire. Wars were fought not just in Europe, but in India, Africa, and the Americas. The 7 Years' War in the 1750s was a truly global conflict and ended with Britain in possession of a vast colonial network. But the cost of empire is always high. When George III imposed new taxes on the American colonies aiming to pay off war debts, the colonists rebelled. What began as protests escalated into war. By 1776, the 13 colonies declared independence. The American Revolution was a shock. Britain, the most powerful empire on earth, had lost a vital part of its identity. George III, who had once been seen as a benevolent monarch, was now painted across the Atlantic as a tyrant. But Britain did not collapse. Instead, it turned inward and forward. At home, the Industrial Revolution was transforming society. Steam engines, textile mills, and mechanized factories were reshaping the economy, the landscape, and the very rhythm of daily life. Cities expanded rapidly. Smoke filled the skies. Children worked long hours in dangerous conditions. It was an age of both astonishing progress and appalling poverty. Politically, Parliament continued to gain power. By the early 19th century, the monarch was largely ceremonial. Laws were passed in Parliament, and the country was increasingly ruled by elected officials, though the electorate remained small and dominated by the wealthy. George III's long reign eventually gave way to the Regency era, as his mental health declined and his son ruled in his place. This was a time of elegance and excess, of Jane Austen and Lord Byron, of lavish balls and quiet scandals. But it was also the backdrop to war, first with revolutionary France, then with Napoleon. The Napoleonic Wars consumed Europe for over a decade. Britain played a central role in resisting Napoleon's ambitions. The Duke of Wellington became a national hero after defeating the French Emperor at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. The victory cemented Britain's role as Europe's dominant naval and colonial power, and so, by the dawn of the Victorian era, Britain stood at a crossroads. An empire, a constitutional monarchy, a nation of factories and parliaments, of poetry and poverty. But that part of the story, the part where railways scream through the countryside, and Queen Victoria sits on the throne for 63 years, that's for another night. So rest, traveller. Let the hum of history lull you to sleep. She was just 18 years old when they came to tell her the king was dead. It was the early morning of June 20th, 1837, and Princess Alexandrina, Victoria of Kent, stood barefoot and solemn in Kensington Palace as the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Lord Chamberlain bowed and addressed her not as Your Highness, but as Your Majesty. The long, uncertain reign of her uncle, William IV, had ended, and with it, an old era quietly bowed out. The age of Victoria had begun. No one, least of all the girl herself, could have imagined that she would reign for more than 60 years, that she would give her name to an entire century, that the world she inherited, still lit by oil lamps, still moved by horses, would not be the same world she would leave behind. Queen Victoria's early years on the throne were a careful dance between youthful resolve and the cautious guidance of her advisers. She had grown up under the controlling eye of her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and her mother's adviser, Sir John Conroy. Their influence had shaped her childhood into one of isolation and protocol. But once crowned, she broke from them swiftly, declaring her own court and carving her own path. A small, determined figure in mourning black, she had a force of will that surprised many. Her reign began during a period of seismic change. England was shifting from an agrarian society to an industrial one at breakneck speed. Factories belched smoke over cities that had once been quiet market towns. Railways carved through the countryside. Telegraph lines stitched distant places together. The very fabric of daily life was transforming, and while progress brought wealth, it also brought poverty, disease, and upheaval. Children worked in mills, families crammed into squalid city slums. Diseases like cholera and typhus spread through overcrowded neighborhoods. Yet, at the same time, Britain was building the foundations of a modern state, introducing public health laws, expanding education, and slowly reforming voting rights. Victoria, for her part, was not the mastermind of these changes, but she became their enduring symbol, and soon, she was no longer alone on the throne. In 1840, she married her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Their union was more than diplomatic, it was deeply affectionate. Albert was intelligent, serious, and forward-thinking. He introduced Victoria to new ideas and played a central role in reforming the royal household. Together, they had 9 children, and their marriage came to represent an ideal of domestic virtue. Albert's influence extended far beyond family. He promoted the arts, sciences, and industry. His crowning achievement was the Great Exhibition of 1851. Housed in the Crystal Palace, a massive glass and iron structure built in Hyde Park. The exhibition showcased inventions, artworks, and goods from across the globe, a bold declaration that Britain was not only a military and colonial power, but a cultural and industrial one as well. But Victoria's world darkened in 1861 when Albert died of typhoid fever. She was devastated. She wore black for the rest of her life and withdrew from public view for years. The nation, mourning with her, also grew restless. Without a visible monarch, the relevance of the crown itself was questioned. It took even but Victoria slowly returned to public life, attending state functions and jubilee celebrations that rekindled her popularity. All the while, the British Empire was expanding relentlessly across continents. India, already under British economic influence through the East India Company, became a crown colony in 1858 after the violent uprising known as the Indian Rebellion or Sepoy Mutiny. The revolt was a brutal clash marked by massacres, retribution, and misunderstandings on both sides. After its suppression, the British government took direct control of India, and in 1877, Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India. It was a title full of pride and contradiction. Victoria never set foot on Indian soil. And yet, her image adorned coins, flags, and official seals across the subcontinent. Elsewhere, British influence spread to Africa, the Caribbean, the Pacific, and the Far East. Colonies were established. Territories were annexed. Local rulers were toppled, co-opted, or bound by treaties. Missionaries, merchants, and soldiers moved together in the name of civilization, trade, and empire. The Union Jack flew from Canada to Australia to Hong Kong, and the Royal Navy ruled the seas. Back home, society was changing just as rapidly. The 19th century saw vast movements for social reform. The abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1833 had been a first step, but many more followed. The Chartists, though ultimately unsuccessful, had called for universal male suffrage and parliamentary reform. Over time, their demands would help pave the way for broader voting rights. By the late Victorian era, more men were voting, child labour was slowly being restricted, and education had become compulsory for children under 10. Public sanitation improved. The middle class grew. The suffragette movement had begun to stir, and still, industrial progress thundered forward. The railways connected every corner of Britain. Steamships shortened journeys across oceans. Electric lights lit city streets. Newspapers, telegrams, and photographs carried information across space and time in ways once unimaginable. Yet for many, life remained hard. In the shadow of great factories, slums festered. Working-class families still toiled for meager pay. Accidents, disease, and poverty remained common. The gulf between rich and poor stretched wider, even as society debated how to narrow it. Queen Victoria, for all her popularity, remained a figure apart from these struggles. She was, by her later years, almost mythical stoic widow, a symbol of empire, an enduring reminder of continuity in a world of upheaval. Her Golden Jubilee in 1887 and Diamond Jubilee in 1897 were national spectacles, celebrating not just her personal longevity, but the vast empire that now answered to her crown. But no reign lasts forever. On January 22, 1901, Victoria died at the age of 81. Her passing marked the end of an epic, the longest reign in British history at the time. A reign that had begun with gas lamps and ended with electric light bulbs. Her death ushered in the Edwardian era, named after her son and successor, Edward. Edward's reign, though short, was marked by social elegance, technological progress, and an uneasy sense of change. The early 20th century glittered on the surface, with its motorcars, grand country houses, and dinner parties. But tensions simmered underneath. Industrial strikes, Irish demands for home rule, growing socialist movements, and the suffrage campaign gained momentum. Abroad, alliances and rivalries were tightening. The great powers of Europe were watching each other with suspicion. The long peace Britain had known protected by its navy and its empire was about to crack. In 1910, Edward VII died, and his son became George V. The world was changing fast and not in Britain's favor. By 1914, the powder keg of Europe exploded. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria triggered a chain reaction of alliances, ultimatums, and mobilizations. Britain, bound by treaty, to defend Belgium and wary of German expansion, entered what would become known as the Great War. World War I engulfed Europe in a scale of violence previously unthinkable. Trench warfare, machine guns, barbed wire, gas attacks, the old romantic ideals of warfare, died in the mud of the Western Front. Millions were killed. Britain lost an entire generation of young men. Every town, every village, would remember their names on cold stone memorials. At home, rationing, mourning, and total war changed society. Women took jobs in factories, on farms, and in officers' roles they had never held before. The war accelerated change, and when it ended in 1918, the country it left behind was not the same. The empire was shaken. The economy was strained, but something more fundamental had shifted. Belief. Belief in monarchy, in empire, in permanence. And though the British royal family survived, where many others in Europe fell, it was forced to adapt. In 1917, George V changed the royal house's name from the German-sounding House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the House of Windsor, a name meant to sound sturdy, British, and enduring. The interwar years were troubled. Strikes, unemployment, political extremism, and the lingering trauma of war haunted the nation. In 1936, a new crisis erupted, not from war, but from love. King Edward VIII, who had ascended after George V's death, fell in love with an American divorcee, Wallis Simpson. The Church of England and the government refused to accept a divorced woman as queen. Edward chose love over duty and abdicated the throne, passing it to his brother, who became George V. It was a scandal, but it also marked a turning point. The crown, once untouchable, was now subject to public opinion and political scrutiny. George V, shy and humble, steadied the monarchy, and it was under his reign that Britain would face its darkest hour. But that's a story best told under a night sky lit by searchlights and echoed by sirens. A story of war, courage, and endurance. The winds of war returned to Britain, not with the boom of a cannon or the flash of a bayonet, but with the low growl of distant engines and the rising scream of air raid sirens. It was September 1939. Germany had invaded Poland, and Britain, standing once more at the edge of the abyss, declared war on Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime. The second great conflict of the 20th century had begun, and the British people, still scarred by the memories of the First World War, braced themselves for what would become a total war, unlike anything they had endured before. At the helm of the monarchy during this perilous time was King George VI. Quiet, dutiful, and deeply patriotic, George had never expected to be king. He had watched his older brother, Edward VIII, walk away from the crown for the love of Wallis Simpson, leaving George with a title he had not asked for and a stammer that made public speaking a cruel challenge. But in war, people look for steadiness. And George, though anxious in private, rose to meet the moment with the resolve of a man who knew he had no choice but to lead. With his wife, Queen Elizabeth, later known as the Queen Mother, George refused to leave London during the Blitz. Even as Buckingham Palace was bombed, they remained in the capital. "The children will not go without me," the Queen said. "I shall not leave the King, and the King will never leave." Their courage became a symbol of resistance. But the early days of the war were grim. The German blitzkrieg had rolled over Poland, then Denmark and Norway. France fell in 1940, and for a terrifying stretch of months, Britain stood alone. Nazi bombers pounded London and other major cities, night after night, in what became known as the Blitz. Civilians slept in underground stations. Children were evacuated to the countryside, and blackout curtains became a nightly ritual. Still, morale held. Radio broadcasts, music halls, and quiet defiance became weapons of their own. In May 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, a bulldog of a man with a booming voice and a gift for words that cut through despair like searchlights through fog. His speeches, broadcast over crackling radios, rallied the nation. "We shall not flag or fail," he thundered. "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall never surrender." The King and Churchill, very different in temperament, became a united front. George supported the war effort with quiet presence and unwavering solidarity. He visited bombed-out neighborhoods, inspected troops, and offered a sense of continuity. To a nation under siege, then came the turning points. In 1941, Hitler made the fatal decision to invade the Soviet Union, opening an eastern front that would stretch his armies thin. In December of that same year, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into the war. The tide began to turn. British and American forces fought side by side in North Africa, Italy, and finally, in 1944, on the beaches of Normandy.D-Day. June 6, 1944, under a grey sky and a cold sea wind, Allied forces launched the largest amphibious invasion in history. British, American, Canadian, and other troops stormed the beaches of France to begin the liberation of Western Europe. It was the beginning of the end. By May 1945, the war in Europe was over. Crowds surged into Trafalgar Square, danced in the streets, sang in bombed-out alleys. Churchill gave a speech. The royal family appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, and the people so tired, so battered felt the strange, trembling relief of peace. But the price had been staggering. Over 450,000 Britons had died. Cities lay in ruin. The empire was exhausted, its resources depleted, its power fraying. Though the Union Jack still flew over far-flung colonies, it no longer did so with unshakable certainty. The war had changed everything. Just 2 years after victory, in 1947, Britain granted independence to India, its most prized colonial possession. The departure marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire. More than 2 centuries of imperial rule dissolved in weeks. Partition split India into 2 nations, India and Pakistan, midst horrific communal violence and mass displacement. And in that same year, something else happened. Something joyful. Princess Elizabeth, heir to the throne, married Philip Mountbatten, naval officer with Greek and Danish royal roots, who had given up his titles and adopted British nationality. Their wedding, held in the austere years, offered a glimpse of renewal, though the kingdom was still on rations. The ceremony was broadcast to millions and hailed as a bright spark in a country rebuilding from the ashes. But peace does not mean stillness. The years that followed were full of movement. Labour governments introduced the National Health Service, state welfare, and social housing programs. Bombed-out cities were rebuilt. The Festival of Britain in 1951 tried to recapture a spirit of innovation and national pride, and slowly, life resumed its rhythm. There were tea kettles boiling, football matches played, and children chasing each other through parks where once sandbags had stood. Then, in 1952, came sorrow once more. While touring Kenya, Elizabeth received word that her father, George VI, had died in his sleep. At just 25 years old, she was Queen Elizabeth II. She returned to Britain immediately. Wearing black, stepping off the plane, no longer a young wife and mother, but a sovereign. The crown, once worn by a stammering wartime king, now passed to a poised, composed young woman whose face would become one of the most recognized in history. Her coronation in 1953 was the first to be televised, watched by millions. It was a grand spectacle ceremony and sacred tradition unfolded in Westminster Abbey, but now piped into humble homes with flickering screens. In that moment, the monarchy stepped firmly into the modern age. Elizabeth's reign would become the longest in British history, but in these early years, she was still learning to navigate a world in flux. The 1950s and 60s brought tremendous social change. The empire continued to unravel. Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Jamaica, and dozens of other former colonies gained independence. Some celebrated, others mourned. Britain tried to reframe the narrative less about loss, more about evolution. The Commonwealth was born, a voluntary association of nations tied by shared history, language, and ideals, if not by empire. Back home, the Suez Crisis of 1956 exposed just how much power Britain had lost on the world stage. When Britain, alongside France and Israel, tried to seize control of the Suez Canal after Egypt nationalized it. The United States intervened diplomatically, but firmly forcing the British to back down. It was a humbling moment. The days of imperial swagger were over. A new world order was taking shape. Through it all, Elizabeth remained a steady presence. She met weekly with prime ministers. She traveled the globe. She shook countless hands and cut endless ribbons. She rarely voiced personal opinions. Her role was to endure. But even endurance carries weight. In the 1970s and 80s, Britain faced new challenges: economic downturns, strikes, inflation, terrorist attacks from the IRA. The monarchy was criticized for seeming out of touch. Yet in moments of crisis, the Queen still embodied a kind of quiet continuity that many found comforting. In 1982, Britain went to war again, this time in the South Atlantic. Argentina had invaded the Falkland Islands, a remote British territory. In response, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher sent a naval task force. The Falklands War was brief but fierce. British troops reclaimed the islands in less than 3 months. Victory was cheered at home, even as critics questioned its cost. The Queen, as always, remained publicly neutral. But her son, Prince Andrew, served in the conflict as a naval officer, reminder that even royal blood could bleed. The 1990s brought both celebration and sorrow. In 1992, what the Queen would famously call her annus horribilis, a fire severely damaged Windsor Castle. Her children's marriages, especially Prince Charles and Princess Diana's, crumbled in the public eye. And in 1997, when Diana was killed in a car crash in Paris, the monarchy faced one of its greatest modern tests. The public mourned openly, emotionally, angrily. They left flowers by the thousands at Buckingham Palace. They demanded a response. For days, the Queen remained silent at Balmoral, shielding Diana's young sons from the media. But, under growing pressure, she returned to London, addressed the nation, and bowed her head as Diana's coffin passed. It was a rare break in the royal masquerade. It worked. The monarchy weathered the storm. As the 21st century dawned, Elizabeth remained. She celebrated her Golden Jubilee in 2002, then her Diamond Jubilee in 2012, then, astonishingly, her Platinum Jubilee in 2022, marking 70 years on the throne. She had served through 14 US presidents and met more leaders than any monarch in history. She was not just Britain's queen. She was the world's grandmother. And then, in September 2022, she passed away. The nation mourned. Flags flew at half-mast. Crowds lined the streets. Her face had been on stamps, coins, and schoolroom walls for generations. She had been the still point in a changing world, and now, the crown passed once more to Charles III. The future of the monarchy, as ever, is uncertain. The world has changed. Britain has changed. But the echoes of the past of war, empire, ceremony, and sacrifice still whisper through the halls of Windsor, through the stones of Westminster Abbey, and through the hearts of those who remember. And that, dear listener, is where we pause tonight. The story of English history is not over. But for now, let the hush of twilight settle over your thoughts. Let the voices of monarchs and commoners alike fade gently into stillness. History never truly ends. It simply turns a page, shifts its tone, and begins a new chapter under familiar skies. As we cross into the modern day, the long arc of English history, once shaped by swords, crowns, and parchment, now flows through microphones, newsreels, and digital screens. And yet, the echoes of the past remain, pulsing quietly beneath the modern rhythm. The monarchy that once ruled with absolute power now moves through ceremonial gestures and constitutional silence. But its presence still stirs curiosity, reverence, and, at times, debate. Charles III ascended the throne after the death of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022. A moment that marked both continuity and change. He had waited longer than any heir in British history, over 7 decades, and by the time the crown finally passed to him, he was no longer the young, outspoken prince once known for his environmental advocacy and unconventional views. He was a seasoned man, stepping into an ancient role at a time when monarchy itself is often questioned. The coronation, held in Westminster Abbey, was a blend of solemn tradition and carefully measured modernity. There were golden robes and ancient swords, anointing oils and oaths to serve the people, but there were also gestures toward inclusivity, acknowledgement of diverse faiths, and subtle changes in wording that reflected a society far different from the one that had crowned Elizabeth back in 1953. As Charles began his reign, the world around him seemed to move faster than ever. Britain in the 2020s was a complex nation proud of its heritage, but grappling with post-Brexit identity, economic instability, climate concerns, and the aftershocks of a global pandemic. The monarchy, once an unquestioned pillar of British life, now walked a delicate line between symbol and relevance. And yet, for many, the pageantry of the crown still held meaning. The royal family itself had become a story within the storia, soap opera, at times broadcast across tabloids and television screens. Prince William, now the Prince of Wales, and his wife Catherine, the Princess of Wales, represented the future of the monarchy in the eyes of many young, composed, modern, and publicly adored. Their children, particularly Prince George, reminded the public of the continuity of the line stretching back 1,000 years. But there were rifts, too. Prince Harry, Charles's younger son, had stepped back from royal duties and moved to America with his wife, Meghan Markle. Their decision to speak publicly about family tensions, racism within the institution, and the pressure of royal life ignited international debate. To some, they were brave truth-tellers. To others, they had betrayed the crown. The rift laid bare the challenges facing a family trying to exist as both a public institution and a private unit under the unblinking eye of 24/7 media. Even so, the monarchy remained, as it had for centuries, both revered and criticized, admired and analyzed. Its strength was never in perfection, but in persistence. It had survived Viking invasions, civil wars, revolutions, and scandals. It had endured changing empires, shifting borders, and evolving values. And somehow, still, it stood. Meanwhile, England itself continued to grow and transform, shaped not only by royalty, but by the millions of lives lived quietly in its cities, towns, and countryside. The skyline of London, once dominated by church steeples and royal palaces, now bristled with glass towers, cranes, and high-speed trains. The streets bustled with languages from across the world. Fish and chips sat beside sushi and shawarma. Curry had become a national dish. Afternoon tea was no longer just served in drawing rooms, but on high streets and motorway cafes. Yet, in quiet corners, the old world lingered. At Stonehenge, the same stones that once watched the sunrise for Bronze Age peoples still cast their long shadows across Salisbury Plain. In Oxford and Cambridge, students still walked cloisters once trod by Newton and Darwin. In village churches, bells still rang on Sundays as they had for generations. English history was not merely something that happened, it was something that lived, breathed, and whispered from ivy-covered walls and winding cobblestone lanes. And as modern England marched forward, so too did the institutions that had shaped it. Parliament evolved, with more representation, louder voices, and urgent debates. Political life grew more polarized, particularly in the wake of Brexit, a decision that divided the country and reshaped its relationship with Europe. Old industrial cities reinvented themselves with digital hubs and cultural revivals. Wind farms dotted the coastlines. Universities attracted students from across the globe. Museums, libraries, and historical societies worked to preserve the past while questioning how it should be remembered. A new generation, less bound by the traditions of monarchy and class, began asking difficult questions. What did it mean to be English? Who did history belong to? Whose stories had been left out? The legacy of empire, once taught with pride, was now revisited with reflection and, at times, apology. Statues of slave traders were debated, defaced, and removed. Colonial histories, long buried under narratives of progress and civilization, were unearthed and examined. The past, it seemed, was no longer a distant mirror. It was a contested battleground for meaning, and through it all, the people carried on. On rainy Tuesdays and bright market Saturdays, in quiet gardens and crowded pubs, in football chants and Shakespeare festivals, in royal weddings and community protests, in ancient rituals and bold new beginnings, this too is English history. Not just kings and queens, but cobblers and coders. Not just battles and treaties, but tea breaks and traffic jams. A tapestry made from all that came before, stitched with threads of memory and identity. It's easy sometimes to see history as something distant, sepia-toned and preserved behind glass. But history is also the now, the breath of someone remembering, the song sung by a child, the echo of footsteps in an old hall. It's the hand reaching back and the gaze looking forward. So as we close this chapter, think of how far this island has come, from Roman camps and Saxon hearths, to Elizabethan stages and Victorian engines, to Blitzer bunkers and modern high-rises, from a place once called Albion to a nation that gave the world Shakespeare, Darwin, and the Beatles, from Magna Carta to parliamentary democracy, from empire to reflection. And yet, the story continues. Perhaps one day, someone will look back on this very moment, and it too will become history, a fragment in a much longer song, a quiet note in a centuries-long symphony. For now though, let the story rest. Let the voices of the past soften to silence. Let the timelines fade gently into dusk. And when you're ready to walk through the next door in this winding corridor of memory, say, in the swirling currents of history, some moments stand out like towering lighthouses, casting light on everything around them. The Industrial Revolution was one such moment for England, an unstoppable tide that transformed a rural agrarian society into the world's first industrial powerhouse. Though its origins trace back to the late 18th century, the 19th century was when its full force reshaped the nation, its people, and its place in the world. Before factories belched smoke and steam engines thundered, England was a land of fields, forests, and scattered villages. Most people lived off the land, tending small plots, raising livestock, and weaving cloth by hand. Life was slow, seasonal, and tightly woven into tradition. But beneath that pastoral calm, the seeds of change had already been sown. The agricultural revolution had introduced new techniques, crop rotation, selective breeding, and improved tools that increased yields and freed many from the demands of subsistence farming. Surplus food meant populations could grow, and fewer workers were needed on the land. These displaced rural folk migrated to towns and cities, searching for work, sparking a migration unlike any before. Into this shifting world stepped the steam engine. Invented and refined by pioneers like James Watt, factories built around water. Power gave way to those powered by coal and steam, untethering industry from rivers and opening up new possibilities. Textile mills, ironworks, and later steel factories became the heartbeats of growing industrial cities. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool exploded in size. What had been sleepy market towns became sprawling metropolises, filled with chimneys, railways, and crowded streets. The pace of life quickened. Time itself seemed to speed up, but the industrial age was no gentle transformation. The conditions in factories were brutal. Long hours, often 12 to 16 a day, 6 days a week. Dangerous machinery without safety guards. Child labor so common it was invisible to many. Workers, men, women, and children packed into small, poorly ventilated rooms, breathing in dust and lint. Accidents, illness, and exhaustion were everyday companions. Housing was cramped and unsanitary. Entire families lived in single rooms, with little light or fresh air. Disease ran rampant. Cholera outbreaks swept through overcrowded neighborhoods. Life expectancy in industrial cities was often lower than in rural areas. Yet, amidst the hardship, a new working class emerged, people bound by common struggles, common hopes, and, increasingly, common voices. Trade unions formed, often in secret, at first, to demand better wages, safer working conditions, and shorter hours. Strikes became tools of resistance. The idea that workers could band together to change their fate was radical and threatening to many in power. At the same time, technological innovation continued at a staggering pace. Railways stretched their iron arms across the country, shrinking distances and reshaping economies. The Great Western Railway connected London to Bristol. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened in 1830, heralding the age of rail travel, and freight steamships crossed oceans faster and more reliably. The telegraph allowed messages to travel near instantly, changing business, politics, and personal communication. The Industrial Revolution also had profound social and cultural effects. The middle class expanded, made up of factory owners, merchants, professionals, and civil servants. They built comfortable homes, sent their children to school, and cultivated Victorian ideals of respectability, morality, and domesticity. The ideals of self-help and progress became national mantras. Education reforms, like the Elementary Education Act of 1870, gradually made schooling compulsory, creating a more literate and skilled population. Literacy rates soared. Newspapers and books became widely available. The arts flourished alongside science and industry, with figures like Charles Dickens capturing the grim realities of urban life and the hopes of the working class. Politically, the pressure for reform mounted. The Reform Acts of 1832, 1867, and 1884 gradually expanded the franchise, allowing more men, though still no women, to vote. The seeds of modern democracy were planted, though the journey was slow and contested. The rise of the Labour Party in the early 20th century grew from these struggles. The Victorian era, overlapping much with the Industrial Revolution, was a time of contradictions. Queen Victoria's reign symbolized morality, family, and empire, yet it coexisted with poverty, inequality, and exploitation. It was an age of invention and oppression, hope and despair. One of the great paradoxes was the British Empire itself, which grew richest from the raw materials and markets that industrial Britain demanded. Cotton from India and America fueled textile mills. Tea from Ceylon and China warmed British homes. Opium from India traded for Chinese goods shaped geopolitics. The wealth generated by industry enriched some but left many in stark poverty. Slums like London's East End became infamous for their squalor. Social reformers, religious leaders, and philanthropists fought to improve conditions, leading to public health acts, housing reforms, and charities. Science advanced rapidly, took Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, challenged long-held beliefs, and sparked fierce debates between science and religion. Medical breakthroughs improved understanding of disease and public health. The world seemed to be both expanding in knowledge and contracting under the weight of its own complexities. The arts responded to the new realities. Writers like the Brontë sisters, Thomas Hardy, and Oscar Wilde explored the tensions between society's expectations and personal desires. Painters captured the grit and grandeur of industrial life. Music halls and theaters offered escapes from daily toil. This industrial era also laid the groundwork for the modern nation-state. The shift from rural to urban life changed political priorities. Infrastructure projects, sewers, railways, telegraph lines required government coordination. Social issues became matters of national concern. Yet, even as England built its modern identity, voices from outside began to challenge it. Movements for women's suffrage gained momentum, with activists demanding the right to vote and equal rights. Trade unions became powerful political forces. New ideologies, socialism, anarchism, and later, communism entered public discourse. The Industrial Revolution was not just a chapter in English history, it was a revolution in how life was lived, governed, and imagined. The echoes of its machines still hum in factories today. The layout of cities, the rhythms of work, the very ideas of progress and innovation all trace back to this transformative era. As we move forward, we will explore how England navigated the upheavals of empire, war, and social change through the turbulent 20th century. The world that industrialization helped create would be tested like never before. For now, Let the steady chug of steam engines and the clang of factory bells fade into the quiet night. The 20th century arrived not with a whisper, but with a roaring era bursting with promise, innovation, and upheaval. England, shaped by the fires of industrialization and the weight of empire, stepped onto a global stage that would test its endurance and redefine its identity. At the dawn of the century, the British Empire was at its zenith, ruling over a quarter of the world's population and landmass. From the sun-baked deserts of Africa to the vast plains of Australia, the Union Jack fluttered as a symbol of power and civilization. London was the heart of an empire on which the sun never set, a sprawling metropolis of wealth, culture, and political might. Yet, beneath this imperial grandeur lay fault lines economic, social and political that would soon shake the foundations of British society. The early 1900s were marked by rapid technological progress and social reform. The introduction of electricity transformed homes and industries, while the automobile began to appear on city streets, promising to reshape transportation and urban planning. Aviation pioneers took to the skies, sparking dreams of global connectivity. At the same time, the voices of the disenfranchised grew louder. The women's suffrage movement intensified, with activists like Emmeline Pankhurst leading militant campaigns for voting rights. Their struggle, long dismissed by the establishment, finally bore fruit after the First World War, when women over 30 gained the right to vote in 1918, and then all women over 21 in 1928. Meanwhile, labor unrest spread as workers demanded better wages, conditions, and representation. Trade unions grew in strength, and the Labour Party emerged as a formidable political force, challenging the dominance of the Conservative and Liberal parties. The Edwardian era, named after King Edward VII, was a time of both social sophistication and simmering tensions as the old order faced pressure from a changing society. Then, in 1914, the world was plunged into a conflict unlike any before. World War I, or the Great War, shattered illusions of progress and peace. What began as a series of alliances and rivalries escalated into a brutal stalemate on the Western Front. Trench warfare, machine guns, poison gas, and artillery reduced vast swaths of Europe to muddy wastelands. Millions of lives were lost, and civilians alike. Britain's involvement was total. Men from every corner of the empire answered the call. Factories retooled to produce munitions and supplies. Women took on roles traditionally held by men, working in factories, driving ambulances, and serving as nurses. The war reshaped gender roles, social structures, and political expectations. The aftermath was grim. The Treaty of Versailles, in 1919, imposed heavy reparations on Germany but failed to secure lasting peace. The Spanish flu pandemic swept the globe, killing millions. Economies struggled to recover. Veterans returned home to a society forever changed. Yet, amid the devastation, there were seeds of transformation. The war accelerated, social reforms workers gained improved rights. Healthcare initiatives expanded, and the suffrage movement triumphed. The League of Nations was formed, though its effectiveness would be limited. Culturally, the trauma of war found expression in literature, art, and philosophy. The lost generation mourned innocence lost. Writers like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon captured the horrors of battle, while modernist artists broke with tradition to express fragmented realities. The interwar period was a time of contrast and contradiction. The Roaring Twenties brought jazz, dance halls, and economic boom to some, while others faced unemployment and poverty. The Great Depression of the 1930s deepened social divides and fueled political extremism. Internationally, tensions simmered. The rise of fascism in Italy and Germany, militarization in Japan, and aggressive nationalism threatened the fragile peace. Britain, cautious and burdened by war debts, struggled to balance appeasement with preparedness. In the late 1930s, Europe edged toward another catastrophe. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Britain once again declared war. The Second World War would test the nation's resilience as never before. From the Blitz that battered London, to the Battle of the Atlantic. From the deserts of North Africa, to the shores of Normandy, British soldiers and civilians endured hardship and sacrifice. Leadership under Winston Churchill inspired a steadfast resolve. The war also accelerated social change. The role of women expanded dramatically. The post-war Labour government established the welfare state, introducing the National Health Service in 1948, offering free healthcare to a radical vision of equality and care. Meanwhile, the empire, that had once seemed invincible, began to unravel. Independence movements gained strength in India, Africa, and the Caribbean. The Suez Crisis of 1956 marked a clear end to Britain's global dominance. Domestically, Britain faced reconstruction, economic challenges, and the search for a new identity. The post-war consensus saw cooperation between parties to rebuild infrastructure, expand education, and foster social mobility. Culturally, the country blossomed with new music, literature, and art. The 1960s brought the Beatles and the swinging London scene, symbolizing a youthful energy and a break from tradition. Through it all, the monarchy adapted. Queen Elizabeth II's steady presence provided continuity amid rapid change. Her reign saw decolonization, technological revolutions, and shifting social values. As the century closed, Britain was no longer the empire it once was, but a diverse, dynamic nation grappling with its past and future. Immigration reshaped cities, and debates about identity, class, and belonging intensified. Today, England stands as a blend of ancient traditions and modern innovation, a land where history is not only remembered, but lived every day. The story continues, always unfolding. The unfolding of the 20th century did not merely reshape England's political and social structures, it fundamentally altered the very identity of its people. The centuries-old notions of class, empire, and tradition were challenged by new waves of immigration, rapid urbanization, and the relentless march of technology. England, once an empire-building titan, began to redefine itself not through conquest, but through resilience, diversity, and cultural fusion. One of the most profound shifts came in the decades following World War II, when Britain opened its doors to migrants from the Caribbean, South Asia, Africa, and the Commonwealth at large. The arrival of the Empire Windrush in 1948, carrying hundreds of Caribbean passengers to London's docks, symbolized the start of a transformative era. These new communities enriched the cultural landscape with vibrant music, food, language, and traditions, but their presence also exposed long-standing racial and social tensions. Urban centers like London, Birmingham, and Manchester became mosaics of cultures. Markets bustled with curry houses, reggae records, and colorful festivals. Yet integration was uneven, and many immigrants faced discrimination, housing shortages, and economic hardship. Over time, however, their contributions helped to build a more plural and dynamic England. In the political sphere, Britain wrestled with the legacies of empire. Decolonization swept across Africa and Asia, often accompanied by struggle and violence. India's independence in 1947 set a precedent, followed by Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and many others. The empire that once dominated the globe was replaced by the Commonwealth of Voluntary Association of Nations, linked by history but free to chart their own futures. This transition was far from smooth. The Suez Crisis of 1956 revealed the limits of British power and accelerated the empire's decline. Britain's attempt to retake control of the Suez Canal, after Egypt nationalized it, was met with international condemnation, especially from the United States and the Soviet Union. The episode forced Britain to acknowledge a new global order dominated by superpowers and heralded a shift toward European integration and a more modest international role domestically. The post-war period saw the establishment of the welfare state, a vision of social justice that promised healthcare, education, and social security for all citizens. The National Health Service, NHS, founded in 1948, remains one of Britain's most cherished institutions, a living legacy of that era's idealism. However, The decades that followed were not without turmoil. The 1970s brought economic challenges, inflation, unemployment, strikes, and political instability. The Winter of Discontent in 1978-79, marked by widespread industrial action, epitomized the nation's struggles. Out of these challenges emerged Margaret Thatcher, Britain's first female Prime Minister, whose tenure from 1979 to 1990 was marked by a radical transformation of the economy and society. Her policies of privatization, deregulation, and union curtailment aimed to revive Britain's fortunes, but also deepened social divisions. Thatcher's Britain was a nation grappling with the balance between market freedom and social cohesion. At the same time, cultural movements flourished. The punk scene of the late 1970s was a rebellious response to economic hardship and political disillusionment. Music, fashion, and art became outlets for new voices, often critical of establishment norms. The late 20th century also witnessed the rise of debates over national identity. The question, what does it mean to be British, took on new urgency amid discussions of immigration, multiculturalism, and devolution. Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland sought greater autonomy, leading to the establishment of devolved parliaments and assemblies in the late 1990s. England itself remained without a devolved parliament, but discussions about English identity and governance grew louder. These conversations revealed the complex layers of Britishness, an identity shaped by union and difference, unity and division. The monarchy, ever a symbol of continuity, faced its own trials. The death of Princess Diana in 1997 deeply affected the public and exposed tensions between the royal family and modern media. The monarchy's role was questioned, yet it endured by evolving, embracing more openness and public engagement. As the new millennium began, England embraced technology and globalization. The digital revolution transformed communication, work, and culture. London became a global financial hub, while cities diversified their economies and populations. The early 21st century was marked by moments of triumph and tragedy. The 2012 London Olympics showcased England on the world stage, blending history with modern vibrancy. But terror attacks and social unrest reminded the nation of ongoing challenges. Politically, the United Kingdom grappled with its place in Europe. The 2016 Brexit referendum, in which a majority voted to leave the European Union, exposed deep divisions within England and the UK. The vote sparked debates about sovereignty, identity, economics, and the future direction of the country. Through all these changes, England's history remains a living thread, a narrative woven from conquest and compromise, innovation and tradition, hardship and hope. Its landscapes are etched with stories of Roman roads, medieval castles, industrial mills, and bustling markets. Its people carry memories and dreams shaped by centuries of transformation. As you reflect on this journey from ancient tribes and Norman kings, through empire and industry, war and peace, to the vibrant, complex nation of today, remember that history is not merely a record of the past. It is a mirror held up to the present, a guide for the future, and a conversation between generations. Thank you for listening. England's story is one not only of kings and battles, but of everyday lives shaped by the tides of history of farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and later, factory workers and city dwellers. As the 20th century unfolded, the transformation of daily life accelerated dramatically, touching every corner of society. The rhythms of work, leisure, family, and community shifted in ways that defined modern England. In the early decades, most people still lived close to the land or in small towns, connected by local traditions and strong community ties. But urbanization pulled millions into expanding cities, where the buzz of trams, the clang of factory whistles, and the glow of electric lights became the soundtrack of daily life. Overcrowding and poverty were harsh realities for many. But cities also became centers of culture, education, and opportunity. The introduction of the weekend, shorter work hours, and paid holidays gradually allowed workers time to rest and enjoy leisure activities. Public parks, libraries, and museums opened their doors to wider audiences. Sport, particularly football, grew from local pastime to national obsession. Stadiums filled with cheering crowds, and heroes like Stanley Matthews and Bobby Charlton became household names. The interwar years saw the rise of cinema and radio as dominant forms of entertainment, bringing stories, news, and music into homes across England. Families gathered around radios to listen to broadcasts, and movie theaters offered escapes from everyday hardships. The advent of television in the post-war years further revolutionized communication, shrinking the world and shaping public opinion. Education expanded significantly during the 20th century. Compulsory schooling extended, and secondary education became more accessible. Universities grew in size and influence, fostering innovation and critical thought. Literacy rates soared, enabling people to engage more fully in civic and cultural life. The role of women transformed radically. From the suffragettes' fierce campaigns to the indispensable work of women in both world wars, gender roles shifted. Women gained the right to vote, entered professions previously closed to them, and balanced new opportunities with ongoing challenges of discrimination and social expectation. The feminist movements of the 1960s and 70s pressed for equal pay, reproductive rights, and broader societal change. Housing improved over time, but the legacy of slums and inadequate living conditions persisted well into the mid-century. Reconstruction included large-scale building projects, with new towns and council estates designed to offer modern homes. While some welcomed these changes, others lamented the loss of traditional communities and local character. The cultural landscape blossomed with the emergence of new voices and perspectives. Literature, music, and art reflected England's complex identity, rooted in history, yet open to global influences. The angry young men of the 1950s wrote about working-class life with blunt honesty, while the Beatles and Rolling Stones of the 1960s became symbols of youth culture and rebellion. Religious life evolved to traditional Christian denominations saw declining attendance, while new faiths entered the public sphere, reflecting the growing diversity of the population. Debates about secularism, morality, and public values became part of national discourse. Political engagement fluctuated. General elections were arenas for debate over the welfare state, the economy, and foreign policy. The Labour and Conservative parties dominated, but smaller parties and movements increasingly influenced discussions about environmentalism, human rights, and social justice. England's place within the United Kingdom remained complex. Scottish and Welsh identities asserted themselves alongside Britishedness, and the Northern Ireland conflict, known as the Troubles, cast a long shadow. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 brought hope for peace, but the challenges of unity and division continued. Throughout these changes, traditions endured and adapted. The monarchy remained a symbol, sometimes controversial, sometimes comforting. Festivals, customs, and national holidays tied people to their shared past while embracing new meanings. Today, England is a patchwork of histories and futures. Old market towns sit beside modern financial centers. Ancient cathedrals share skylines with cutting-edge architecture. The English language itself reflects centuries of change, absorbing words from Norse, French, Latin, and languages brought by immigrants. The story of English history, then, is not just about power or politics. It is about how people live, love, struggle, and celebrate. How the past shapes the present. How each generation adds its own thread to the tapestry. And so, as we pause here, consider the everyday moments, the laughter, the hardships, the small victories that together create the pulse of a nation. As we journey further into the depths of England's rich tapestry, it becomes clear that history is not merely shaped by grand events or towering figures, but equally by the subtle, often overlooked currents that run beneath the surface, those of culture, language, art, and everyday experience. These intangible threads, woven together, create the fabric of a nation's soul. Take, for example, the English language itself. Born from a chaotic fusion of Anglo-Saxon tongues, Celtic influences, Norse invasions, and Norman French. It evolved over centuries into the rich, expressive medium that now connects millions around the world. The language reflects England's complex history, its invasions, its trade, its empire, and continues to grow with the voices of immigrants and modern innovators. Literature stands as one of England's greatest gifts to the world. From the epic poetry of Beowulf to the witty plays of Shakespeare, from the moral fables of the Victorian novelists to the experimental works of the modernists, English writing has chronicled and shaped human experience. These stories of kings and commoners, of love and loss, of conflict and reconciliation, have helped define England's cultural identity and influenced global imagination. In the 19th century, the rise of the novel coincided with societal shifts brought on by industrialization. Writers like Charles Dickens exposed the harsh realities of urban life, poverty, and child labor, inspiring empathy and reform. The Brontë sisters delved into human psychology and social constraints, while Thomas Hardy portrayed the tragic struggles of rural folk against the tide of change. Moving into the 20th century, English literature reflected the fractures and hopes of a modernizing world. The disillusionment after World War I found voice in the works of T.S. Eliot and Virginia Woolf, who experimented with form and perspective. Post-war writers grappled with questions of identity, morality, and progress. Parallel to literature, the visual arts in England evolved dramatically. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in the mid-19th century challenged classical conventions, emphasizing detail, color, and romanticism. Later movements, like the Bloomsbury Group, bridged traditional and modernist aesthetics, influencing art, literature, and criticism. Architecture too tells a story of change and continuity. England's landscape is dotted with medieval cathedrals, Tudor houses, Georgian townhomes, Victorian factories, and modern skyscrapers. Each style reflects the social and economic conditions of its time. Stone walls of monasteries embodying faith and power, red brick terraces, housing workers, glass and steel towers, symbolizing commerce and progress. Music, from the folk songs passed down through generations to the classical compositions of Edward Elgar and Benjamin Britten, has been a vital thread in England's cultural heritage. The 20th century saw England emerge as a global hub for popular music, with bands like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and later artists shaping cultural revolutions that transcended borders. Religious life, once the cornerstone of English identity, evolved amidst secularization and pluralism. The Church of England, established during the Reformation under Henry VIII, remained the state church, yet its grip on society loosened as other faiths grew. Immigrant communities brought Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, and more, enriching England's spiritual landscape. Education became a powerful force for change. The expansion of universities and the introduction of comprehensive schooling opened doors for many who had been excluded from academic opportunities. This shift played a critical role in breaking down class barriers and fostering social mobility. Throughout all these developments, England grappled with questions of national identity and belonging. The relationship between England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom remained complex, marked by cooperation and contestation. Devolution in the late 20th century granted varying degrees of self-governance. Reflecting diverse histories and aspirations, England's political landscape in the late 20th and early 21st centuries became more pluralistic and dynamic. New political parties emerged, social movements gained momentum, and debates over immigration, multiculturalism, and globalization sparked intense discussions about the nation's future. Technology accelerated change. The digital revolution transformed communication, commerce, and culture. Social media reshaped political engagement and community. Yet, with these advances came challenges: privacy concerns, misinformation, and social fragmentation. In the face of rapid transformation, traditions persisted and adapted. Annual events like Trooping the Colour, Remembrance Day ceremonies, and the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace continued to attract interest. Connecting present-day England to its historical roots, the monarchy, long a symbol of continuity, embraced modernization while navigating controversies and changing public attitudes. The balance between public service and private life remained delicate, played out under relentless media scrutiny. As England navigates the complexities of the 21st century, it stands as a nation both deeply rooted in history and constantly evolving. Its story is one of resilience and reinvention, of embracing diversity while cherishing heritage. The past informs the present, guiding the nation's steps into an uncertain yet hopeful future. As the calendar pages turned deeper into the 21st century, England found itself at a crossroads shaped by both its illustrious past and the relentless pressures of a rapidly changing world. The nation faced challenges that tested its social fabric, political cohesion, and cultural identity, yet within those challenges lay opportunities for renewal and growth. One of the defining moments of recent history was the Brexit referendum in 2016, an event that stirred powerful emotions and divided opinions. The decision to leave the European Union marked a dramatic shift in England's relationship with its closest neighbours and raised questions about sovereignty, economics, and national identity. The campaign leading up to the vote unveiled deep frustrations among many communities, concerns over immigration, economic inequality, and the pace of globalization. The aftermath of Brexit was complex and at times turbulent. Negotiations with the EU stretched on, stirring uncertainty among businesses and citizens alike. The question of Northern Ireland's border reignited tensions, underscoring the fragile nature of the United Kingdom itself. Politically, the landscape shifted as parties realigned, and new debates emerged over the future direction of the country. Beyond the political arena, England grappled with social inequalities that had persisted despite decades of progress. Economic disparities between regions, often called the North-South divide, remained stark. Urban centres like London thrived as global hubs of finance and culture, while some former industrial areas struggled with unemployment and underinvestment. Efforts to level up these disparities became central themes in policy discussions. Though outcomes were uneven, the nation also confronted pressing environmental concerns. England, like much of the world, faced the realities of climate change, temperatures, extreme weather, and biodiversity loss. Public awareness grew, fueled by activists such as Greta Thunberg and grassroots movements demanding urgent action. Government initiatives aimed at reducing carbon emissions, transitioning to renewable energy, and protecting natural habitats took center stage. Though debates about pace and impact continued. Culturally, England flourished as a diverse and creative society. London remained a global arts capital, hosting galleries, theatres, and festivals that celebrated both heritage and innovation. The multicultural tapestry of English cities was evident in vibrant culinary scenes, music, fashion, and literature, reflecting the contributions of communities from every corner of the globe. Education and technology continued to evolve rapidly. Digital platforms transformed learning, connecting classrooms worldwide and opening access to knowledge. The rise of artificial intelligence and automation prompted discussions about the future of work, ethics, and human creativity at the same time. Traditional institutions and rituals persisted, providing a sense of continuity. The monarchy, under King Charles III, balanced respect for heritage with efforts to reflect modern values, focusing on issues like environmental stewardship and community engagement. Social debates intensified around issues of identity, inclusion, and representation. Movements advocating for racial justice, gender equality, and LGBTQ+ rights gained prominence, challenging the nation to confront its history and strive for a more equitable society. England's cities and towns embodied this complex mix of past and future. Historical landmarks stood alongside cutting-edge architecture. Markets selling centuries-old crafts existed beside tech startups and innovation hubs. People lived layered lives, connected to both tradition and change. Internationally, England's role continued to evolve. While no longer the imperial power it once was, it remained influential through diplomacy, culture, and economics. It balanced relationships with the EU, the United States, Commonwealth nations, and emerging global powers. Throughout all this, the English spirit resilient, inventive, and reflective persisted. It showed in moments of national pride, quiet, everyday acts of kindness, and the willingness to question, adapt, and grow. History, after all, is not static. It is a living conversation between what was, what is, and what might be. As this part of the journey closes, consider how England's story, like all great stories, is made up of countless voices, decisions, and moments woven together. The path forward remains unwritten, but deeply informed by the legacies that precede it. England's story, like the ebb and flow of the tides along its rugged coastline, continues to be shaped by the interplay of tradition and transformation, of memory and innovation. As we move deeper into the 21st century, the country faces new horizons with a blend of cautious optimism and critical reflection. One of the most striking features of contemporary England is its cultural diversity, a vibrant mosaic of languages, religions, customs, and artistic expressions that enrich everyday life. Cities pulse with the rhythms of festivals, markets, and neighborhoods celebrating global heritages while remaining distinctly English in spirit. The culinary landscape is a testament to this fusion, where fish and chips coexist with curries, jollof rice, and bow buns, where traditional pubs offer spaces for conversations that bridge generations and backgrounds. The arts continue to thrive, reflecting the complexities and contradictions of modern life. British literature, theatre, music, and film engage with themes of identity, migration, technology, and history, often questioning and redefining what it means to be English today. Creators like Zadie Smith, Benedict Cumberbatch, and Banksy explore these evolving narratives, blending past and present in compelling ways. Education remains a cornerstone of national life, but faces challenges of accessibility, funding, and adapting to a digital age. Universities attract international students, fostering global exchange, while debates about curriculum and purpose prompt ongoing discussions about the role of education in a rapidly changing world. Politically, England is part of a United Kingdom navigating its own internal tensions and aspirations. The push for Scottish independence, discussions around Northern Ireland's status post-Brexit, and calls for greater English representation shape the political landscape. These debates underscore the delicate balance between unity and autonomy. Within the Union, environmental concerns have become central to national and global discourse. England's commitment to reducing carbon emissions, investing in green technology, and preserving natural habitats reflects an urgent awareness of humanity's impact on the planet. Community initiatives, youth activism, and government policies converge in efforts to forge a sustainable future. Technological innovation propels England into new realms, from cutting-edge research in artificial intelligence and biotechnology to the digital transformation of industries and public services. The nation stands at the forefront of 21st century science. Yet, these advancements also raise ethical questions, privacy concerns, and debates about the future of employment and human connection. The social fabric is ever evolving. Movements advocating racial justice, gender equality, LGBTQ+ rights, and mental health awareness have gained momentum, prompting institutions and communities to confront historical injustices and build more inclusive futures. At the same time, challenges such as economic inequality, housing shortages, and public health remain pressing. Despite rapid change, tradition holds an enduring place in English life. Festivals like Guy Fawkes Night, Remembrance Day, and St. George's Day link communities to shared history and values. Historic landmarks, castles, and museums preserve stories that continue to inspire and educate. The monarchy remains a potent symbol of continuity and adaptation. King Charles III's reign, emphasizing environmental stewardship and community engagement, seeks to bridge tradition with contemporary concerns. The royal family's role in public life is ever evolving, balancing ceremony with service. As England steps further into this century, it carries the weight of its complex history and the promise of innovation and inclusion. The challenges are many: political, social, environmental, but so too are the opportunities for renewal, dialogue, and growth. The journey of this island nation is far from complete. Its story is one of resilience and reinvention, of holding onto roots while reaching toward the future. Thank you for sharing this moment in England's unfolding history. England's narrative is as much about its people as it is about events, institutions, and innovations. The heart of the nation beats within its community's ordinary individuals, whose lives weave together to form the complex social fabric that defines English identity. From bustling urban neighborhoods to quiet rural villages, the stories of families, workers, artists, and activists provide a human perspective on centuries of change. Throughout history, migration has played a key role in shaping England's population and culture. Waves of newcomers from Anglo-Saxons and Normans to Huguenots and Jewish refugees, and more recently from the Caribbean, South Asia, and Eastern Europe, have continually enriched and challenged the nation's sense of self. This ongoing process of adaptation and integration has often sparked tension but also creativity, forging a multicultural society that is both diverse and distinctly English. Community life has transformed dramatically over time. In the past, village green and parish church were centers of social interaction, providing rhythm and meaning to daily existence. With industrialization and urban growth, new spaces emerged: pubs, factories, markets, and later sports stadiums, and cultural venues where people connected, celebrated, and struggled together. The 20th century saw the rise of a consumer culture, leisure activities, and mass media that shaped collective experiences. Cinema, radio, television, and now digital platforms brought stories, music, and ideas into homes and public spaces, connecting individuals across regions and classes. This shared cultural consumption helped build a sense of national belonging. Even as local identities remained strong, education and literacy expanded opportunities for many, allowing for social mobility and new forms of political participation. Yet inequalities persisted, often aligned with class, race, and geography. Efforts to address these disparities through policy and activism have been ongoing, reflecting England's commitment to fairness and justice amid complex social realities. Religion, while no longer the dominant force it once was, continues to influence many lives. The Church of England, other Christian denominations, and diverse faith communities contribute to the nation's moral and cultural landscape. Interfaith dialogue and secularism coexist, shaping public discourse on ethics, community, and values. Family structures and gender roles have evolved, reflecting broader social changes. Traditional extended families gave way to nuclear households, and later to diverse arrangements reflecting personal choice and societal shifts. Women's increased participation in the workforce and public life transformed family dynamics and societal expectations. England's artistic and intellectual life thrives on this diversity of experiences. Writers, musicians, filmmakers, and thinkers draw inspiration from the multifaceted nature of English society, exploring themes of identity, history, conflict, and hope. Their works challenge assumptions, provoke debate, and offer visions of what England can be. Sports, too, play a central role in community cohesion and national pride. Football, cricket, rugby, and tennis have passionate followings, bringing people together across social divides. Historic events like the FA Cup and Wimbledon are celebrated traditions that unite the nation. The challenges of the modern era: economic pressures, housing affordability, healthcare access, and social cohesion, pressing. Yet the resilience and resourcefulness of England's communities provide a foundation for addressing these issues. Grassroots initiatives, volunteerism, and local governance empower citizens to shape their own futures. Technology continues to redefine how people connect, work, and learn. The rise of social media, remote working, and digital services offers opportunities and challenges alike. transforming social interactions and community engagement. As England moves forward, the stories of its people remain central to understanding its identity. Each individual life contributes to the ongoing narrative, tapestry woven from countless voices, dreams, and struggles. This human dimension reminds us that history is not only about dates and events, but about the lived experiences that give meaning to those facts. The landscapes of England, from its rolling countryside to its bustling cities, have always played a crucial role in shaping its history and identity. The relationship between people and place weaves through centuries, influencing economic activity, cultural traditions, and social structures. The green and pleasant land described by poets like William Blake is not merely a poetic ideal, but a reality shaped by millennia of human interaction. From the prehistoric earthworks and stone circles dotting the moors to the medieval cathedrals rising in market towns, England's physical environment tells stories of adaptation, conquest, faith, and innovation. Agriculture dominated England's early economy for centuries. The open fields, hedgerows, and village commons were managed through communal practices that sustained generations. The agricultural revolution, with its enclosure acts and mechanization, transformed these landscapes, increasing productivity, but also displacing many rural workers, propelling them toward the growing industrial cities. The Industrial Revolution reshaped not just society but the very terrain. Factories, railways, and canals cut across the countryside, while mining scars and urban sprawl altered ecosystems. Cities like Manchester and Birmingham rose from humble beginnings to become industrial giants. Their smokestacks, symbols of progress and pollution alike. Yet, amid industrialization, a romantic movement emerged, an appreciation of nature's beauty and a yearning for pastoral simplicity. The works of Wordsworth, Coleridge, and later, the arts and crafts movement championed the value of craftsmanship, natural materials, and the preservation of the countryside. In response, conservation efforts took root. The National Trust, founded in 1895, became a guardian of historic houses, gardens, and natural landscapes. Public parks and green spaces within cities were developed to offer respite from urban life. The countryside remained a cherished refuge and symbol of national heritage. England's coastlines, rivers, and forests also shaped its economy and culture. Fishing villages, ports, and shipyards connected the island to global trade and empire. The Thames River, winding through London, was both artery and witness to centuries of commerce and change. The natural environment influenced folklore, literature, and art. Stories of mythical creatures, ancient trees, and sacred wells embedded in the landscape reflect a deep human connection to place. This heritage persists in festivals, place names, and cultural memory. In modern times, environmental awareness has become paramount. Urban pollution, habitat loss, and climate change pose significant threats. Efforts to promote sustainability, renewable energy, and biodiversity conservation reflect a renewed commitment to stewarding the land responsibly. Urban planning balances development with preservation, seeking to maintain the character of historic towns while accommodating growth. The revitalization of city centers, investment in public transportation, and creation of greenbelts illustrate this dynamic. Rural areas face challenges to economic shifts, aging populations, and the pressures of tourism. Yet communities innovate through agritourism, local food movements, and heritage projects. Blending tradition with contemporary needs, England's natural landscapes continue to inspire creativity and reflection. Artists paint its vistas, writers set stories within its settings, and residents find identity in their surroundings. The land, ever-changing, yet enduring, remains a silent partner in England's ongoing story shaping, and shaped by the people who call it home. England's story is inseparable from its city's dynamic hubs where history, culture, and innovation converge. Each city tells a unique tale, reflecting layers of past and present, weaving together the lives of its inhabitants into a rich urban tapestry. London, the capital, stands as both symbol and stage for England's grand narrative. From its Roman origins as Londinium, to its emergence as a medieval trading centre, London grew to become a global metropolis and ever-evolving cityscape, blending ancient landmarks like the Tower of London and Westminster Abbey with sleek modern skyscrapers. Its streets have witnessed monarchs and revolutionaries, artists and entrepreneurs, tragedies and triumphs. Beyond London, cities such as Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, and Newcastle tell stories of industrial might, cultural vibrancy, and social change. Manchester, often called the world's first industrial city, played a central role in textile manufacturing and labour movements. Liverpool's docks linked England to the Americas and beyond, shaping a city rich in maritime heritage and musical innovation. The birthplace of the Beatles, Birmingham emerged as a manufacturing powerhouse, earning the nickname, the Workshop of the World. Its diverse communities contributed to its strength and character. Newcastle, perched on the River Tyne, combined coal mining with shipbuilding and a strong local identity. Each urban centre faced challenges: pollution, poverty, housing crises, also embraced regeneration. Post-industrial cities reinvented themselves through culture, education, and technology. Universities flourished, theatres thrived, and festivals celebrated local heritage and global connections. Public transportation, systems buses, trams, and the iconic London Underground linked people and places, enabling commerce and daily life. Markets, pubs, and public squares remained focal points for social interaction, maintaining community amid urban density. Cities also reflected England's multiculturalism. Waves of migration brought new languages, religions, cuisines, and traditions, enriching urban life. Neighbourhoods like London's Brick Lane and Birmingham's Balti Triangle became vibrant centres of cultural exchange. Urban planning grappled with balancing preservation and progress. Historic districts and modern developments coexisted, often uneasily, reflecting debates over identity and change. Efforts to improve green spaces and sustainability shaped policies and public spaces. England's cities played crucial roles in politics and social movements, from the Chartists of the 19th century demanding voting rights to contemporary protests for social justice. Urban centres were arenas of activism and dialogue. Education and research institutions anchored many cities, fostering innovation and economic diversification. Tech hubs, creative industries, and startups added new chapters to urban stories. Despite challenges, England's cities remain places of opportunity and cultural vitality. Their histories are written not only in stone and steel, but in the daily lives of millions of workers, students, artists, families who continue to shape the urban experience. As England's cities evolve, they carry forward legacies of resilience, diversity, and creativity, standing as microcosms of the nation itself. As we arrive at the final chapter of this immersive journey through English history, it is fitting to reflect on the enduring spirit that has carried the nation through centuries of triumphs, trials, and transformations. England's story is a complex tapestry woven from countless threads of kings and commoners, conquerors and settlers, poets and labourers, visionaries and everyday people. The nation's resilience lies not merely in its ability to endure, but in its capacity to adapt and reinvent itself. From the ancient tribes that first settled its shores to the modern citizens shaping a digital future, England has continually embraced change while cherishing its heritage. The landscape's rolling hills, fertile fields, misty moors, and vibrant cities serve as a living backdrop, reflecting both nature's constancy and humanity's imprint. The echoes of history resonate in castles, cathedrals, and cobblestone streets, while innovation pulses through research labs, studios, and marketplaces. Culture remains the beating heart of England, rich in literature, music, theatre, and art that express the nation's multifaceted identity. The English language, spoken by millions worldwide, carries the nuances of this history, its triumphs, contradictions, and dreams. Social progress has been a long, often challenging journey. Movements for equality, justice, and inclusion continue to shape society, reminding us that history is not a closed book, but a living dialogue. England's strength emerges from its diversity, its capacity to listen, learn, and strive for a more just and compassionate future. Politically and globally, England stands at a crossroads, navigating the legacies of empire, the realities of globalization, and the aspirations of its people. The questions of identity, sovereignty, and community remain central to national discourse, reflecting a vibrant democracy and engaged citizenry. Looking ahead, the challenges of climate change, technological transformation, and social cohesion demand creativity, cooperation, and courage. England's story invites each generation to contribute, to learn from the past, to embrace the present, and to imagine new possibilities. Thank you for joining this long and reflective journey through English history. May it deepen your understanding, spark curiosity, and inspire a sense of connection to the enduring narrative of this remarkable nation. As the night draws to a close, I invite you to pause, reflect, and carry forward the stories you have heard. History is a shared inheritance, a gift and responsibility. If you enjoyed this quiet storytelling, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, and leaving a thoughtful comment. It helps more than you know. Until next time, keep wondering, keep exploring, and good night.